my collaborator, Oliver Kellhammer, and I have been developing a concept of ruderal witchcraft. I'm just going to get my slides going here. So this concept of ruderal witchcraft, understood as a set of practices that are specific to planetary weedy natures that work their way at the edges and interstices of public and private property, and which are entangled with a range of other human and non-human outcasts of capitalist modernity. And in the slides, I also nod to a handful of related creative projects and collaborations of mine and Oliver's that pertain to these opportunistic species, these ruderal species and their entanglements. And I won't always speak to these projects in the writing, the paper that I'm going to share, but they'll just complement if you're watching the slides. And just to say, this writing and these images are very much mine and Oliver's, and they're born of several years of conversation and collaboration, very rich collaboration. So I'm just going to dive right in here and think about the ways that the frontier functions as a cheapening force, as a force that also creates what wave fronts of disturbance, of open soil, rubble, fallen trees, and possibly new contexts for opportunistic interlopers, sometimes familiar and sometimes unfamiliar travelers that make use of all possibilities for transportation that modernity offers. So I'm working from patterns to details here. This piece is still in process, and I'm still in the process of being radicalized and working to understand how we got to the realities of the Capitalocene, what is to be done. So bear with me as I try to work out these foundational histories. So pre-settler colonial North American natures cannot, by settler colonial logics, be understood as co-constituted by indigenous peoples. Instead, North America is and was conceived by colonizers as vast, untouched wilderness as resource, so that indigenous genocide can occur, so that ecologies are radically simplified for industry and industrial agriculture, enables forced labor, and the land base is stripped to the point of near collapse. The romantic notion of pristine, untouched nature also operates as a counterweight to its overexploitation through the 19th and 20th centuries. John Muir's conservationist ethos continues the idealization of untouched nature as well, and thus the idea that all humans fundamentally destroy nature, once again obliterating the history of indigenous food forestry practices throughout North America and indeed the world. And I bring this up because the romantic notion of pristine, untouched nature makes histories and futures of mutually beneficial engagement with and between natures beyond the backyard garden, beyond the top-down management structure of the farm, hard to imagine or impossible. And this process of othering nature, of romanticizing and exoticizing, but also of dismissing, is importantly a process of cheapening within capitalist modernity. And capitalist modernity rests on binaries: mind, body, man, woman, civilization, wilderness, society, nature, that, as many ecofeminists, including Deborah Bird Rose, argue, mask singularities, right? Singularities that privilege mind, man, human, industrial progress, and in the process cheapen other categories such as women, indigenous, nature. And this othering structures science, state, and market ideologies required for ongoing primitive accumulation, right? So of which European colonization, genocide, and slavery are its brutal forms. So as this ideological frontier and this literal frontier, this process of marking what is hands-on and what is hands-off nature, this making impossible, and this impossibility of engagement creates unexpected openings that might not be recognized by power. Ruderal ecologies are born at this cheapening frontier, this frontier that simplifies ecologies, depletes the land base. They're born in newly devastated wastelands at the edge of the monocrop, beneath the hooves of horses and cows, and long forgotten spaces too, amidst laboring and exhausting natures. Born there, but then the ruderal occupies, undoing the clean lawn, the big monocrop, the conservation area. cheap, unseen, disrespected. The ruderal is the wavefront between territories, roadside verges, abandoned industrial sites, mines, where extraction and commodification define a frontier and then abandon it. So you see ruderal ecologies all around you. They are underfoot between the cracks of cement as you're rushing to work on a Sunday stroll. Your child probably finds them interesting. You see them. They're on the side of the highway and at the edge of the airstrip. They subsume the grass and a lawn. Ruderal ecologies weave through the homeless encampment on the edge of town or beside the river. National borders are ruderal zones, forming their own unique ecologies. You see them in between city buildings and empty lots, in the gaps in the cement, the squares of soil for street trees and dog shit, on the side of highways and dusty strip malls, in traffic triangles at the edges of monocrop agriculture, between the heaving cracks of old post-industrial lots and abandoned factories, microscopic and large. These are ecologies that travel with us, interact with us, push at the edges of our knowing. These are spaces we see but don't see, confusing landscapes just beyond the grasp of our understanding. They're betwixt and between the modern construction of society and nature, public and private, civilization and wilderness, not entirely outside the space of care, but certainly not inside it either. Importantly, rural landscapes are landscapes of the poor and working classes, landless proletariat, and that they are spaces where nature has been cheapened and then abandoned. And as inheritors of capitalist legacies, we see them, but busy people try often not to see these abject, transitory, wasted sites as anything other than an unpleasant interruption in their journey to another, better place. Ecologies, because Oliver and I like to think about them in terms of relationships and entanglements, never as isolated species, or certainly not first. Relationships convey meaning differently. If we begin with the relationship, then we understand the identity to follow. Then we understand that the way we define a species as insectary, remediator, or invasive, for example, depends on the relationship between soils, microorganisms, insects, toxins, animals, and plants. So the ruderal serves as heresy or apostasy, defying tidy notions of a natural or pristine nature, thriving in spite of, in fact, because of industrial development having come, accumulated, contaminated, and gone. This is their power and their danger. Danger because, as we know, ruderal species often work as a cheapening force for capital, threatening valuable indigenous kinship networks, thus creating new cheap frontiers. Though this idea of threat is often the result of ignoring the strength of indigenous responsiveness, as Potawatomi scholar Kyle White reminds us, warning that indigenous vulnerability is a white construct that enables empire. So one kind of resistance to the cheapening process of the frontier that White acknowledges is to get to know these ruderal ecologies as they emerge in all their stages of succession. Who are they helping? Who are they hurting? What larger structures of exploitation are they supporting and or resisting? And in getting to know them, their shifts and claims, their collaborations over time, can we learn to time travel and shapeshift with them? So since early modernity, witches have worked along the fence lines of enclosure. With their ruderal allies, they move between wild and cultivated realms, healing and poisoning, understanding the ruderal as both a promising and dangerous sanctuary for becoming. And we are interested in considering the category of witches too as ruderal. Like many ruderal plant and animal species, witches are cast out with the ongoing enclosure movements. If witches survive persecution, they're left to haunt the periphery. The categories of witches and weeds are categories of accusation used to organize, discipline, create value. And like their weedy familiars, witches also poison and heal. So at least since the 16th century, witches have been relegated to the edges of property, forced to ply their craft in wastelands and burned out heaths, territories as yet unclaimed. In other words, in the unwanted remains of multi-species commons, in the ruderal spaces, the in-between spaces of care and non-care. The end of feudalism was brought about by the climate event of the Little Ice Age, the Black Death, and by persistent peasant organizing and commoning environments across Europe. And for Oliver and I, this moment in history sends weedy seeds forth into the future, possibly to break the spell of capitalist modernity. And in Silvia Federici's seminal 2004 book, Caliban and the Witch, she demonstrates how women, in particular older women, were often central to peasant organizing that brought about the collapse of feudalism. So commons were shared spaces for lateral organizing, community care, the reproduction of life, the reproduction of culture, for exploring alternatives. Witches in the European commons were skilled in the use of plants and worked with natural cycles that shaped celebrations and harvests. Older women often held the memory of negotiations around land and resource use in the commons. And if capitalism was to take hold, witches with their ability to reproduce life, culture, and community would need to be removed, and commoning would collapse as a result. So thus, we see the increasing regulation of women's bodies, whether it be regulation of sex work or of women's decisions around childbirth, as well as the production of the docile, complicit white woman. There are also staggering numbers of witch hunts. Federici tracks how the demonization and extermination of witches in Europe not only produces a docile white woman, but also becomes the template for the demonization, oppression, and extermination of colonized subjects across European colonies. So ruderal witchcraft offers new and very old powers to counter or grow over the beasts of capitalism, which comes from the Anglo-Saxon root wick, to bend into shape. And we understand this work when paired with more than human ruderal ecologies to be a process of bending time and shaping perspectives towards planetary justice. And a witch's power is power that is established as power with, as Starhawk describes it, rather than power over. And power with is the power to influence, the power to suggest and be listened to begin something and to see it happen. And in the case of ruderal witchcraft, we understand this power with to include non-human kin, listening and acting to be a collaborative endeavor beyond the human. So we propose that the power to act with the ruderal, to enact ruderal witchcraft, can gesture to revolutionary ecologies of work, as Jason Moore calls it, in, around, ahead, and beyond, and behind ongoing capitalist enclosure. And importantly, the ruderal can never entirely be taken up by the totalizing project of capitalist modernity and its late stage form of cyberneticism or cybernetic capitalism. So this project, Ruderal Witchcraft, inaugurates a twisted cultivation guide for a set of practices, gestures, tendings, cultivations, and conjurings specific to modernity's outcasts, staying one step ahead of and one step behind processes of accumulation and exploitation. And for initiates, Ruderal Witchcraft proposes that ruderal ecologies can be spaces of sabotage and retreat from those systems. And I've long been inspired by Ricardo Dominguez's use of the term gesture and understanding a performative social practice. He situates the material, immaterial gesture within Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed and within situationist spatial practices. And in doing ruderal witchcraft, we continue this work, operating within the social imaginary and gesturing to possible worlds of collective abundance, collective resistance, and sanctuary. So ruderal witchcraft practices prioritize relationship over speciation, involve partial, contingent, and relational healing, remediation and danger, include sorcery, invocation, and conjuring, includes seasonal observations, ritual and ceremony, often require horizontal organizing and governance strategies, and engage practices of TimeCraft, such as fortune telling, hauntology, and necromancy. And through these practices, ruderal witchcraft is key to reviving commons, understood by Peter Linebaugh as spaces of cooperative labor, common resources, and communal distribution. So active relationships with weedy, rapidly reproducing species that primarily operate in everyday spaces of disturbance give guerrilla gardeners, activists, artists, witches, and other practitioners concerned with the ongoing threats of the global Capitalocene new spatiotemporal opportunities for magic, sabotage, and retreat. So now I'd like to go through some of these practices in a bit more detail and offer some of the ideas that underpin each, and offering some specific actions from time to time. So as I've said, ruderal wastelands are born of catastrophes with harsh temporalities at their core. Future temporalities that privilege progress and techno-utopianism, while also waxing nostalgic for an untouched nature of the past that never grieves the violence and devastation of capitalist modernity. And our unfolding and cascading catastrophe is born of denial of difference, of reciprocity, of what Deborah Bird Rose calls the moral claims of the past. And yet the very ruins most of us wish to evade are waiting to be noticed, waiting for us to reckon with the weeds, toxins, boulders, pasts. Mugwort and ground ivy emerge out of dusts and corpses. The ruderal is a graveyard, charnel ground, always ruined. And it is through ruderal ecologies that the evidence of the past 500 years of catastrophe unfolds in ever increasing detail as we learn how to read them. We read them like a secret language of anti-capitalists who are dispossessed of their multi-species commons through the global commodification of labor. Plants like kudzu, Japanese knotweed, and ice plant haunt with intertwined stories of the transcontinental railroad, settler colonialism, and Chinese migrant labor as soils and native ecologies erode with the laying of train tracks, for example. And when we stop thinking the future will solve our problems, we are left with Polonia and Atlantis heaving through the sidewalk, along with the histories of commerce and globalization. And we create a grammar by reading the plants in the landscape. And the work of Teresa Alves is one example here, as she tracks the ballast offloaded from slave ships, filled with opportunistic seeds from Europe and the shores of Africa, which creates the ground one still stands on in New York City. So quite simply, the first kind of TimeCraft we introduce is the practice of grief. And here I draw from a collaborative grieving project I do with another collaborator, Bibi Calderaro, a series of projects actually called Unearthing, Re-Earthing. And in our writing about this work, we understand grief is tied to Vinciane Desprez's articulation, understood here through Tom Van Doren as a very particular process of learning to be affected, in which the borders between self, world, and other are profoundly problematized. And it's part of a becoming together inside rich histories of biosocial inheritance and relationship. And just distinguishing this from despair, which I think we do a lot of. So we are also interested in what grief does. It's through grief that one understands that life comes to matter, says Desprez, and it is by accepting this grief that it counts. And understanding also that this grief work is never complete and never whole. So which understands how important it is to observe cycles of life and death in the seasons and other more than human cycles. Fertility emerges from death. So consider compost, a matrix of life and death, which the witch Asia Rose Bond identifies as womb and tomb. Consider ruins. The root meaning of ruderal is rubble. And so the work of the ruderal witch is to recognize the complex dynamics of living and dying in the Capitalocene. And so the ruderal invites us into new conceptions of social time, new ways of understanding more than human cycles, rhythms, cultivations, and relationships that open up the present. The ruderal also helps us to recognize how violent pasts continue into the present, in turn helping us to attune to new cycles, cultivations, and rhythms. So we can also think about the TimeCraft of the ruderal witch as including a nuanced understanding of the ways that the ruderal works in areas of disturbance over time. This is nuanced work because not all ruderal species operate in the same ways, because they're highly mutative, nor will they be the same in different spaces. Some ruderal plants need to be hand pulled one by one from an area because they will wipe out other species and do damage to the habitat of critters and pollinators. But the ruderal witch knows that some plants, as my collaborator Oliver observes, what was once ruderal will become differently ruderal as later stages of succession do their time work, either ecologically as in afforestation and inflow of relic biodiversity that happened in Chernobyl, or through mechanisms of turning wasteland into valuable property, gentrification, the subsumption of brownfields into real estate. Thus, the ruderal is a space of immanence where anything can happen, a protean zone whose possibilities have not yet been actualized as they wait to unfold. And Oliver has done mini ruderal succession projects where weedy ruderal plants are used in order to enable simultaneously hands-off but recuperative forestry projects. His work with Robinia or black locust is of interest. He plants it in wastelands and empty lots and in already ruderal environs. And as it grows, creates leaf litter and begins to shade out other more dominant ruderal species that aggressively populate areas, almost acting as scabs. And at the same time, Robinia is providing nitrogen to the soil through its collaboration with rhizobia bacteria in the soil. And the leaf litter is providing new context for other species. And Oliver has seen the near extinct American elm reemerge in this context, providing interesting fodder for how we might understand how ruderal species can lay the literal groundwork for the reemergence of lost charismatic species like the elm, which once thrived as a companion species in the so-called US before it was overplanted and thus susceptible to disease. So yeah, ruderal species can enable this kind of recuperative timecraft. So knowing how to read ruderal ecologies means reckoning with how the violence of capitalism and colonialism is ongoing. Ruderal plants and their relationships haunt us, demand we connect with the ghosts intertwined at their roots. They perform a kind of necromancy that will not stop until we learn to heed the ongoing and unfolding catastrophe. And in other words, the ruderal demands powerful timecraft through communion with the dead and through grief. So a witch's alignment with the shape-shifting superpowers of hyperecologies and hyperorganisms affords new opportunities to exceed enclosure, opportunities to exceed nationalist categorizations of more than human life, and positive models of resilience, especially in relationship to climate change, pandemics, and other disastrous conditions. Japanese knotweed appears in areas a year in advance of Lyme's disease, for example, and is now known to be effective against COVID. So Oliver's term hyperecology describes the renegotiations that occur as native and non-native biota bump up against each other in the niches afforded by rubble and heaved up earth. So the side of roads and their disturbed hot sandy dishes are where roadside runoff, agricultural runoff, invasive species, and native species commingle. And in central New York, plant biota is shoved to the periphery as land was deforested and then plowed for corn. And incredible guilds emerge between the edge of highways and byways and cornfields. One example is a bloodroot purple loosestrife viburnum guild that often includes garlic mustard, box elder, and sumac, all of which are tolerant to roadway salt. And bloodroot is a growing ground cover found in forests from Canada to Florida. And in central New York, it has suffered habitat loss to deforestation and hasn't been growing back in new growth forests. Instead, it seems to be finding community amongst loathed purple loosestrife and box elder. And we speculate on the relational functions of these commingling species. Beside cornfields, we must assume there is an excess of nitrogen in these ditches, and purple loosestrife is known to remove excess nitrogen and phosphorus. Loosestrife provides erosion control along with sumac in these sandy slopes and protects exhausted land. Even as loosestrife is loathed, it is working to create new contexts for thriving alongside its native and introduced allies. Leaves of garlic, mustard, and rich soil, which bloodroot appreciates as much as it does the slope of the ditch and the dappled shade of viburnum, box elder, and sumac. So a complementary term of Oliver's, hyperorganism, describes the hybridity that emerges within an organism as native and non-native species commingle. Hyperorganisms defy speciation. Their phenotypic diversity is in a responsive and shifting state, co-evolving with their environments, and the which relates to introduced hybrid beings and their allies, and in so doing understands more deeply how their world is evolving. Context and relationship determine how weeds prevent their phenotype from site to site, or present their phenotype from site to site. Nutrient and condition are important determining factors, both of which can be shifted by the other plants and animals growing nearby. In other words, hyperecologies can inform the shape of hyperorganisms, and relationships precede individuals. Further, what might appear to be a discrete organism might turn out to be a shifting amalgam of selves cohabitating in a common body. Some of the most recognizable entities in the Tehran Vogue of the American Northeast, for example, the Japanese knotweed, Oriental bittersweet, and the coyote, are not in fact discrete species at all, but hybrids, self-assembling comings together of multiple organisms that combine into single yet contingent wholes. And further still, consider interventions that can enable hyperorganisms. The ruderal rootstock of calorie pair is adaptable accomplice, co-conspirator in ecological liberation and solidarity. The calorie pair tree invites an inquiry into the suspicious concurrence of ornamentality, sterility, and globalization. Landscapes whose sole goal is ornamentality often determine ways of seeing that obfuscate direct relationship and reciprocity, preventing us from seeing the interdependent and intertwined fates between species. And exclusively ornamental natures, it reify nature as landscape, as property, even when they're in public spaces. So conveniently, it seems ornamentality is more easily achieved when plants are brought from elsewhere, as the settler communities will have no prior knowledge of how to relate to these displaced and seemingly pacified natures. And in the case of fruit trees in public space, ornamentality is paired with sterility so that the ability for a tree to reproduce is neutralized. So the calorie pair, Pyrus calleriana, travels to the United States from Vietnam and China at the turn of the 20th century. And the Bradford cultivar, among others, was made sterile for the streets of Washington, D.C. as an ornamental, posing as docile and idealized street tree. But when the other calorie relatives haunt nearby, the small dry fruits fill with potent seed and get spread by birds. And these varietals now travel uncontained, sprouting quickly and spreading fast across the disturbed landscapes of the mid-Atlantic, manifesting a range of phenotypic diversity, interbreeding, sometimes growing thorns. So consider the scion branch as stick, wand, staff as gesture. A scion grafted onto the ruderal calorie gestures to the possibility of new multi-species commons in our midst, while still firmly reminding us of the past. The graft there operates as consensual partnership between species or cultivars, partnering to regenerate fecundity and fruit. We think the wild, sometimes thorny Pyrus calleriana can be rootstock to any number of climate vulnerable pear varietals, since it is so adaptive, taking root in all kinds of soil and changing conditions. It could be a perfect host to species that aren't so quick to respond to dramatic temperature changes and disturbance. Can we eye the pears grown to the south of us and begin to graft these neighbors onto the Pyrus calleriana? And when pears are so often sold as exotic commodities, inaccessible to the poor, can the Callery offer a people's pear, more accessible and adaptable in the rural and urban food deserts that are more and more in our midst? In the commons, in the context of crafting commons and governance, ruderal alliances offer new opportunities for commons and solidarity. Commons are spaces of negotiation, usufruct practices, shared resources, cooperative labor, and often more directly recognize the more than human web of life. The Americas before European colonization were mostly commons, and we can find active commons in Chiapas and the Amazon and Oakland, California. And the historian Peter Linebaugh, one of our great historians of the commons, finds connected examples from the Mississippi Delta to the Upper Nile to Ireland, for example. So old women historically have been central to the practice of the commons, as I talked about before, and recognizing that commons are sites for the reproduction of culture. And old women have historically been central to negotiations and facilitations of shared agreements in these spaces. In reclaiming the term witch, we are recognizing this history as well as the genocide of women in Europe that was required in order for capitalism to take hold. So today's urban commons often begin as ruderal abandoned spaces. They often persevere when they're started as tactical interventions, sites of guerrilla gardening. And this was the case with Strathcona Park in Vancouver, a site which Oliver, along with a number of other guerrilla gardeners and non-human conspirators, transformed over the course of 10 years. And as Oliver writes, the land had been used as an informal dump site for years, and the ground was littered with garbage and construction debris, as well as the detritus from the neighborhood's thriving sex and drug trades, including the empty Lysol cans drained, discarded condoms and hypodermic syringes. And beginning with the cover crops, ruderal experiments like Scotch broom in combination with Robinia plantings described earlier, and cooperative labor, a network of edible ecologies emerge. And with the cooperation came better resistance to the city government that sought to destroy the project and ultimately failed to do so. And Oliver writes, as well as spending a lot of time observing the natural processes of recovery that were already happening on the land, I interviewed most of the gardeners, many of whom didn't use English as their primary language, to get a sense of the aspirations they had for how the garden should develop. I used simple community mapping techniques where I distributed maps to the gardeners, showing the outlines of the property and had them sketch in where they thought key elements such as paths, structures, and common areas should go. Using this technique, I was surprised at how much people already agreed on. So in the end, it was possible to do a lot of the design work with a minimum of formal meetings, many people would have been anyway reluctant to attend. So Oliver's work with maps matches my own experiences with working in urban commons, where remembering agreements and keeping the focus on shared resources is key. With hierarchies of power come conflicts that are never resolved, a paradigm where decisions are more important than alignments. Resentment and blame, or violence or the threat of violence, is the way a problem is solved. So ruderal witches can enact strategies for negotiation, communication, and resource shares. And far from utopian, these spaces, these social formations recognize the process of engaging conflict as central to organizing well and a critical element of consensus building. So witches and other ruderal beings have the ability to heal, to poison, and to remediate damaged landscapes. And as a zone of contamination, the ruderal is latent with the threat of hidden poison, but also due to its regrowth of healing, toxin accumulating herbs, contains within it the seeds of its own recovery, or what nostalgic humans would see as recovery. The plants of wastelands, ruderal herbs, paradoxically constitute some of the strongest medicines. Japanese knotweed for Lyme's disease, for instance. In fact, ruderal plants are some of the best medicines for emerging diseases, as I mentioned before. So Ruderal Witchcraft resists a holistic idea of healing in favor of the idea of contingent healing, healing that is always bound up with the healing of one's neighborhood or community, kin network. Ruderal plants engage in numerous ecological functions, preventing erosion, offering biomass, pulling up toxins, breaking up clay soils, for example. And the bioremediating abilities of many ruderal ecologies and hyperecologies should not be understated, but our understanding of bioremediation also needs to be reassessed when ecological processes are so often employed and labeled as ecosystem services to restore properties for the market. And for these reasons, we argue that the ruderal ecologies and ruderal witches need to at time be tactically poisonous, ugly, unreadable, potentially dangerous. So today I'd like to point out one plant for healing, one for poison, and one for remediation from the Ruderal Witches pouch. So we'll begin with plantain. So much more humble than the rampant jungliness of the bittersweet vines and knotweed groves. The little ribbed plantain, Plantago lanceolata, and its cousin Plantago major, ubiquitous in sidewalk cracks and foot-stomped city parks, is no less polymorphous and adapting to challenges. Plantain is a very healing botanical for the human body. The leaves are used externally as a poultice to draw out toxins, bites, and stings, and it has an incredible sucking power, able to pull out any number of unwanted materials under the skin. Use it right after removing a tick, getting stung, or being bitten by spiders or snakes. Use it when you have an unknown skin infection. Plantain works internally as well, healing the lining of the digestive system and the stomach and intestine, acts as an astringent, vulnerary, and even adds some soft mucilage to the healing process. So Potawatomi environmental scientist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer notes that that her people call plantain white man's footsteps, and she generously writes about this plant as just a low circle of leaves pressed close to the ground with no stem to speak of. It arrived with the first settlers and followed them everywhere they went. And this wise and faithful plant, faithfully following the people, became an honored member of the plant community because it is so useful, not only to humans, but also in its ability to break up clay soils, draw out its toxins. So one poison, for herbalists, when a plant is poison or a cure, it depends on dosage. We could think about ailanthus, bittersweet, or pokeweed here. Small doses can support the body's fight against cancer, for example, but large doses are very toxic. But so here, let's give a shout out to poison ivy. Poison ivy love spaces of disturbance and seem to be a kind of celebration or almost mocking of disturbance at times. And it's also a master of disguise. It travels as a vine, but can also be seen to be a small sprout or medium-sized bush. And its vines will wrap around trees, but can be hard to spot when leafless. And its leaves can be different shaped, and it hides among different plants, English ivy, Virginia creeper, sarsaparilla, and its cure, jewelweed. So I wonder if it can protect nascent commons from unknowing interlopers from a less discerning eye. Could we use a plant like this to deter an interest in a site, or to to prevent it from regimes of property? So one bioremediator. We've talked about purple loosestrife, about Scotch broom and robinia. Here, let's choose the common reed. In this case, Phragmites australis, subspecies australis. Also a hyperorganism, given how it's mixed with the native Phragmites. It can filter wastewater from lavatories and gray water from kitchens once the solid waste is settled out. The water could then trickle through a constructed wetland or artificial reed bed, where bioremediation, bacterial action on the surface of the roots, and leaf litter removes some of the nutrients in biotransformation. So the water is then suitable for irrigation, for groundwater recharge, or release into watercourses. And it might not be ideal in native wetlands, but consider its advantages in highly toxic sites near water where it can grow densely. And a friend of the muskrat, it can stabilize eroded shores. So finally, in Magick, Sabotage, and Retreat, we argue that aligning with and learning the work of witches and weeds, we can stay ahead of and maybe even outside of capitalist structures in order to renew ourselves, to enact alternatives, and eat at its edges. Magick and its incompleteness and seemingly ineffectuality, when combined with weedy runaway species, can never be completely captured by cybernetic capitalism, which, weeds shapeshift and morph, do the unexpected. The ruderal exists within poison, ruin, danger. So the practice of ruderal witchcraft enables an alignment with places of resistance and also sabotage. Understanding that in order to enable resistance, we need places of retreat, of sanctuary, commons, places to reproduce ourselves and those we love. The French anarchist group Tikkun argues that cybernetic capitalism has taken root in the entirety of our network society. Understanding that cybernetics is the entire field of communication and control, as Norbert Wiener declared it. The cybernetic hypothesis is the merging of capitalism and cybernetics in the 1970s in the interest of sustaining and expanding capitalism's violent ethos, which includes the creation of and the integration and thus dissolution of difference. And Tikkun, to quote Alex Galloway, sees the cybernetic hypothesis as a specific epistemological regime in which systems or networks combine both human and non-human agents in mutual command or control. And here, power is driven by the assumption that biological, physical, and social patterns can be adjusted through step-by-step processes or algorithms. So feedback activates protocological responses. So the adjacent fields of systems theory, game theory, information science, and ecology are co-developed with cybernetics and inform an approach to how to dominate the production and regulation of society. So interdisciplinary scholars like Gregory Bateson, biologists like Francisco Varela, designers like Buckminster Fuller contributed to and built off cybernetics during its second wave in the middle of the century. Conceptions of self-governance, autopoiesis, emergence percolate during this time, as well as the notion of homeostasis in nature, of nature as a system or an ecosystem, often giving us problematic tools with which to understand the dynamics of exchange and prospects for survival for humans and non-humans, right? These ideas of homeostasis, of nature and balance, ideas which have been discredited by science still hold sway in the popular imagination. But practical whole systems design strategies that utilize feedback and self-regulation also emerged from the second wave of cybernetics and might complicate the ease with which cybernetic capitalism totalizes and thus disregards non-human lives and their labor. So a principle of permaculture whole systems design is to add diversity of life, to add difference to a problem. This process of adding diversity of life compels me because in my mind, it simultaneously floods a constructed ecosystem with new material, but it also creates an environment for retreat. And this is the kind of tactic that Tikkun argues for in their essay, short-circuiting and unplugging, sabotage and retreat. And they see this as a temporal strategy of slowing down the system. So does the system recover and assimilate the new process, form, life, relationship? If so, has anything been achieved? Tikkun argues that the slowdown effect of these processes might make them not reducible to information or to interaction, or at least not so quickly. Something to consider the next time we are out amongst the seeds of our favorite weeds.
Wow, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was really, again, so many ideas floating up from that incredibly rich conversation. I mean, talk, and also the different threads that you brought together were really fascinating. And you know, I think often from the conversations I've had, also likewise with Oliver Kellhammer, of these kind of slow practices that take long time to really unfold. And we all know the slow food movement, but this is moving in a whole nother direction, I think, where we really have to reconsider these kinds of both attention on our parts, as you've been doing with plants for so long, and people like Ellie Irons and Anna Chimay with sturgeon fish, etc., to, you know, ways that we can extend these practices. And I think that this book or article, or however it manifests, of Ruderal Witchcraft will be a really great gift to everybody to try and think through this, along with all the other presenters today. So much there. Does anybody, there has been a kind of side chat going on by people. I wanted to see if maybe either Ellie Irons or Anna Chimay want to jump in with a question. Otherwise, we will open it up to other people.
I'm seeing some conversation about, I'm just glancing over, I'm seeing the
so
Japanese
much,
knotweed.
I know. Well,
Yeah,
there's big
let's do it.
questions
Let's talk about
that.
Japanese knotweed.
So some people have been asking, like, you know, that's terrible. Don't go near that stuff, you know. So let's try and pull that apart a bit. Sure, Ellie, jump in.
I actually didn't want to jump in. I wanted to maybe throw it back to the original question answer so she could express. I think it was, is it Bria or Brea? Because I mean, I think it's always such a good topic to get into, and I wanted to give her a chance to articulate that. If you want to. I mean, the question's already up there in the beginning. I think it's earlier in the chat.
Yeah, I was asking about Japanese knotweed because when I bought my house 10 years ago, there was a lot of it in the backyard, and there is now a lot more. This stuff is evil. It's not only non-native, but it's extremely invasive. As I said in the chat, I understand that it does have some newly discovered or perhaps recently acknowledged medicinal properties, but it takes over and kills off everything around it. What are your thoughts about that?
You know, I tend to think, thank you so much for that. And knotweed is always, it's the one, you know, so like, and yeah, let's wrestle with it. We can stay with the trouble there for a minute. So I have a lot of thoughts, obviously, about Japanese knotweed. I'm just going to say, I think it's really beautiful, especially this time of year, the way that it starts to change. The leaf colors get really interesting. They start turning yellow, and the seed pods start to emerge, and purple. There's like it's really gorgeous to me. And it really
gorgeous
takes
too,
over
until it takes over.
Yeah, and so I mean, these are case by case, you know. I would say with most invasive species, or so-called invasive species, they are case by case. But I do tend to also think that our feelings about these new plants mask a grief, right? It's almost like our sort of despair about these plants that move in, displace a grief about or prevent a kind of grieving about the many species that are disappearing or have disappeared. And so I think when we sit with this plant and just recognize that we're not going to get rid of it, right? It's not going to go away. In fact, probably digging it up creates more of it. What do we do then, right? How do we work with it? And yeah, I mean, I don't have any great answers for that, but I think also, I mean, it does challenge regimes of property, and you know, for homeowners, that's not great news, right? But it also creates different, you know, I think there's opportunities for understanding different kinds of value, right? And it's not a kind of value that emerges from regimes of ownership.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I have been struggling with that concept with poison ivy, which is totally manifests here, beautiful in the fall, but like how to deal with it. Luckily, I'm not very prone to getting affected by it, so I can handle it better. But some people aren't, so there are these kinds of plants, as you mentioned, that are thought of as dual purpose plants.
Yeah. And I guess I'm just interested in how, right, like if we are just oriented toward, like, having done a lot of work in the urban context, as many of us have, this came up earlier in Scott's talk as well, like what, there's always this moment of like, oh my God, I'm just bioremediating this land for the next condo development, right? And so just thinking tactically about how can we work with these plants in a way that is, creating a kind of a wall or a kind of way of like sort of obfuscating other work that's happening deeper in, for example, if we're thinking spatially. Is there ways that we can sort of, collaborate or conspire? Because I think if we're just bioremediating or we're just creating like these recognizable aesthetic spaces, we're just giving them over.
Yeah,
ultimately.
I mean, unless somebody else has a question they want to jump in with, I just want to turn the conversation a little bit differently to the concepts of grief that you've been bringing up. And I think this is really fascinating because I think that there's something really quite rich there for me anyway, in terms of being able to think with these new shapings of looking at landscapes and looking at different ecologies and trying to embrace them. And kind of, I'm trying to, what's interesting is trying to, for me, understand what I'm grieving having lost, because some things I don't really care about so much, like a lawn, but then maybe I do care about a lawn, this kind of cut grass, prim, pristine gardening practice that we've grown up with, or I have grown up with anyway. So I really want to thank you for bringing that into the conversation alongside of all of this other consideration, because I have not considered that as much. And I am somebody who's very interested in death and grieving. So I think that this is a great combination to sit with.
Yeah, it sort of connects to some of the conversation that that was coming up yesterday about how to think about trauma, and do we focus on violence or do we try to find other ways of doing the past? Yeah, the work that I've done with BB Calderaro has started with the question of is it possible to grieve the passing of non-human lives in this moment? So we've done these like all night events, like very long durational events where we just sit and, sit in silence and in conversation to sort of start to feel into what's possible. And we've had the same experience where suddenly we find that we're grieving the loss of insects, right? Like not having like lots and lots of insects on the grill of our car. Like for those of us that lived in the 70s and 80s, that was a common phenomenon, doesn't really happen anymore. And so, we spent an hour just naming all of the insects that we know of, right? And so it's like, whoa, like this is not where I expected to go, but it was a deeply, felt process. So
thanks. I will think about that a lot more and continue this conversation with you. Paul has had his hand up, so I wanted to give him an opportunity to speak out.
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity. So many things have just come together for me. For example, the notion of assigning harm versus the notion of thriving as a person's identity was brought up with the Max in the beginning. And I can see how this is the sense of grief is a process of growing towards greater thriving in a different way that comes from versatility. So I want to say that at the outset. And then on a particular level, relative to my hometown, Rochester, New York, we used to talk about how Rochester is going down the drain. You know, we were going to lose Kodak eventually, Xerox and Bausch and Lomb. How people were saddened by this deindustrialization of Rochester, and I'm starting to realize now that time for grieving was during its heyday in a lot of ways. And then I think of a time when I went to a sewage treatment plant in Webster, and it was very, very near Xerox. And Xerox, which is now not much of a industrial facility anymore. Their sewage treatment plant had cherry tomatoes growing in it, and the plants looked pretty good. I remember the sewage treatment plant guy telling me, "Yeah, but you can't eat them." So, and the thought is, I just think of all the different topics we brought up today in this conference about rural ecology and what was growing and what's growing now, and I'm just curious about your comments on all that stuff.
Yeah, I'll pick up the thread of sort of temporal work of grief, and it's something that I really wrestle with, because I think and I think even in the paper I did this a little bit, but like, just thinking about the ways that like there's a tendency to say, oh, if we grieve, then we'll have a better future, or somehow like we'll do this work so things will get better later, and that's so just like a part of how, I think the capitalism structures our thoughts about the future, right? The future is also always a space of salvation, or of something better. And I think in the process of grief, there's a turning away from the future altogether, right? There's a tending to the past and the present. And yeah, I think about that especially in terms of my positionality and the way, as a white person, that, and like, is there a way that doing this grief could enable other futurities, Indigenous futurities, Afro futurities to emerge? I don't know, it's not totally worked out, but I think it is really tricky, like, because grief has its own time, right? Like it's a totally different space, right? Everything changes, right?
I'm going to jump in now. Thank you so much, Margaretha. And I'm sorry we didn't get to your question, Beverly, about witchiness as cultural appropriation. How do we tap into depths with respectful understanding of its history? Who owns its protocols? Hopefully we can get into that in our final discussion.
Yeah, great question.
Yeah, really great. But for now, Margaretha, thank you so much for channeling us into these healing powers of rural witchcraft. And thank you, Kathy, for the journey you've constructed, having us end with that, and in this weekend's rural exploration.